You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
G'day listeners and welcome back to The Dead Prussian. As you know, we've had a bit of a delayed start to 2022, and as I would like to blame lots of different conditions out there, I can quite honestly say it's entirely my fault for starting new adventures. But my new adventures can wait. You can find out about them on social media by following me. I want to get right into where we're going with our first episode, which is an episode of a long-time contact of mine who's been quite supportive actually of the Dead Prussian, and also a lot of Australian military officers getting into the writing space and the research space. My guest today, for those who haven't guessed it, is Major John Spencer, US Army retired. He's the chair of urban warfare studies with the Modern War Institute at the US Military Academy at West Point, New York, and he's the co-director of its Urban Warfare Project. It's an initiative to study the character of war in cities. And for those people who have been following the Urban Warfare Project, it is quite valuable right now, whilst we're seeing a lot of conflict in Eastern Europe. And you can pick up some very, very good understanding about how war is currently being fought in cities by following the Urban Warfare Project and seeing some of their analysis as they go through and comment on some of the conflict that's happening in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. John, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, Mick, thanks for having me. I'm a longtime fan, as you know, and listen to every episode as soon as they come out.
Well, John, you must be the only one because no, that's there's a couple more out there. Hi, Mum, how are you going? John, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a while. I've been trying to get you on the show for a while, but I've been the delay. And those people who have been on the show know that as a producer, I'm one of those people that says, hey, do you want to come on my show? And then the next time you hear from me is probably 6 months later. But John, before we start discussing your book, which is what I really want to talk about, Connected Soldiers, but before we discuss your book, I really want to learn what motivated you to join the Army and then subsequently go into this writing, researching, and educating stage of your military career.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mick. I mean, I joined while I was still in high school as a 16-year-old kid, and then started my career at 17. Joined as an infantry private, and then really had just an amazing 25-year career in the U.S. Army as an infantry soldier and infantry officer. Later, really the Where's Waldo of opportunities. There's John Spencer, from being a part of a group advising our 4-star general, the chief of staff of the Army, to jumping into combat in Iraq in 2003, returning in 2008 at the height of the surge. So just an amazing career, and I have nothing bad to say about it. And I ended it, which leads to the writing, teaching at West Point, where I still work remotely. I have a dream job. I think we'll probably talk about that. But that was my last assignment. My wife was in the military as well. And just right place, right time. One of the guys assigned to our department had worked with, I think he was a USA Today correspondent, PhD in international relations, just a genius. A little bit of a mad scientist though, like with crazy hair and everything. But he gave a class on how to write an op-ed or an article for a newspaper. So I thought I'd give it a shot. And within 2 tries, so I wrote one article for the War in the Rocks, which is a great platform for military personnel that want to start writing. And then the second one I wrote was about what would later become the book. So it's ironic. It's the start of my writing career. I pitched it to the New York Times, and it got accepted. And the guy who had taught me the class, and he's, what do you mean you got accepted? I'm like, they answered and they said they'll take it. He's like, it evidently is like winning the lottery.
Yeah.
But that article and the response that you get and the release, the challenge of writing, I just fell in love. And then from then on out, that was 2015. I've written hundreds of articles, 2 books, multiple book chapters. And most of the listeners will know some of the names, like our Strategy Strikes Back book and Game of Thrones book, things like that. But I fell in love with writing in general, but it was really at the very end of my career, which is fine. I was armed with a career with the experiences, a little bit of pragmatism in what I was writing about, and then I fell in love with researching as well, because I have a dream job and I get to travel the world and research urban warfare. So that's really how it happened. It was just an amazing journey.
And a shout out, not just to those people involved in the Strategy Strikes Back and the Game of Thrones book, a great bunch of people to work with, but also to Ryan Evans from War on the Rocks. So some listeners may or may not know this, those that listen to every episode would. But Ryan and I actually served in Helmand Province, Afghanistan together.
Wow.
And I don't think there was any inclination there at the time to start a podcast or on Ryan's behalf, a media empire in discussing modern international relations and conflict. But it's interesting how these experiences have shaped how modern discourse is promulgated, because it's obvious that there was a bit of a gap because people like yourself came out of your experiences and wanted to communicate them, which is what we're about to discuss now, which is you recently published a book called Connected Soldiers. Now mainly for the listeners, what is the main focus of the book?
So it's first and foremost a memoir of my combat experience, first as a platoon leader in 2003, and then as an infantry company commander in 2008, and then later as a retired soldier with my wife going off to war and me staying home with 3 kids. But there's a theme which is related to the title about the aspect that I really fell in love with researching, is why people fight, and how does what I would later call the band of brothers affect, right? The bonds we form with each other in the military that historically in all research becomes the sole or the prevailing reason why people fight is for the people to the left and right of them, and they form this bond. So in the book, I talk about my 2003 experience, which to me really resembled the image of war that I had in my mind, going off with a small band of brothers, a small band of men and women, disconnected, experiencing war together. And as the world changed, I went back in 2008. The army was different, the war was different, but also the connections between the soldier and home was completely different. There was no longer a lapse in information. The soldier had a foot in both worlds. The family had a foot in both worlds. And if you fast forward to now, in the Ukraine, we can talk about that it's even more than I wrote about the book. But the title is called Connected Soldiers because one is war is a group endeavor. Each individual soldier is connected to his group, his fellow soldiers, and that's the only way they survive war. It's like the actual act of fighting. It's a team, and each individual has to do their part. They have to rely on each other. And as I analyze it more, but it's also part of the coping with the war is the bonds that they've formed with each other.
And in the book, you talk about, or you write about, you don't talk unless do you read the audiobook? You've got an audiobook of it. Is it your voice?
The audiobook just came out and I wanted to read it, but work got in the way. Ukraine happened. I'd started the intro.
Yeah. Well, apparently the conflict in Ukraine's quite inconvenient for a lot of people as well. So we just rack up another unfortunate event there. But so you definitely don't talk about it. Someone else talks about it on your behalf for the audiobook. Make sure you check on your royalties. I've heard stories of authors not getting all their royalties from audiobooks. So have a check of your contract. But if your publisher's listening to this, I didn't give him that advice. But you write about primary group cohesion. And for some of our listeners, what is primary group cohesion? And how does it relate to combat in how you discuss it in the book and also your experience?
Sure. So primary group cohesion is like the the image that people have when you mentioned the word cohesion, but of course cohesion has many facets. You have task cohesion, where a group understands that they have to work together to achieve a task, a mission. Then you have social cohesion, where the group has bonds with each other, that they accomplished it as a group because of their relationships with each other. So they agree that part of that bond. Where primary group cohesion is, it is in the military, that small unit. There's certain caps on the number, but where the cohesion is through interpersonal relationships, like each other. So that primary group is that squad, that platoon, that company, that is your cohesive group. You can be cohesive as a much larger organization by the definitions of cohesion, but primary group is that where you really know them through interpersonal relationships.
Mm-hmm. And you also discuss shared combat experiences, right? And so you just talked about primary group cohesion, group dynamics. How do the shared combat experiences, how do they influence the group dynamics?
Sure. So one, cohesion is the bond, right, between everybody that forms a group, and then you almost replace your individual identity of yourself with the group's identity. Like you're willing to sacrifice for the group. Well, the interesting part, and what I try to ask myself hard questions: how is cohesion formed? It's almost sometimes taken for granted in the military. Well, we know from research that there's two primary ways that cohesion is formed in small groups of fighting soldiers, but you could say in a company or in life. One's through shared hardships, shared experiences, right? You struggle as a group, whether that's in sports or in training or in combat, which is, of course, the greatest shared experience, and can be a hardship, hopefully not traumatic, but it bonds you to, you all experienced it together. You feel like they understand what you did it as a group. You only survived it as a group.
Mm-hmm.
So that shared hardship is how the bonds form, right? And that's why we take so much time in the military to do things together to try to create those, like hard exercise or big training events, etc. But I relied on a lot of other people's research for the book as well, just to show that actually in some of the research, the bonds are formed with just spending mindless hours together, getting to know somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it was the shared experiences, and sometimes those can be enriched or kind of more impactful if they're shared hardships, firefights, things like that. But in the other terms, it's just a lot of time spent in close proximity talking to each other. It seems almost common sense, but it's actually not, especially where connections come into mind.
And it's unique, isn't it? So it's not a normal experience for most modern societies to be paired up with people outside your family group, community group, and sometimes for many of us outside your national group, and then to spend significant periods of time in each other's pockets. Not literally people, that's a figurative term, but to spend, if they're a thief, they might spend a bit of time in pockets, but spend so much time together. It's not a normal thing that we see, and we haven't seen it for a long time in primarily Western countries. It hasn't been, but most modern societies don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, we have words for this stuff, that things like community, my friend Sebastian Younger called it tribe. Where it's human nature. And you're right, in the military, we or individuals in the military services get to experience the height of this phenomenon of being a part of a community where there's selfless service, group identity, which establishes group norms, but it's very tribal. It's very, we have different words for it, but it's essentially community. And in the modern age, unfortunately, we're more connected, by telecommunications and access to information than we've ever been in human history, but we're also more alone. And often there's less community, less tribe, less family.
And as we move on into the next section, that's a perfect segue to the question. You must have seen these questions before, but for our listeners, understanding that dynamic between how soldiers previously were removed from the community, but now and had no contact, right? So you were removed from your community, you removed from your family. I remember my deployment, which was after this connectivity started happening, but whenever there was a soldier injured or killed, all the communications on the base or what you had access to, depending on where you were, was shut down, right? And that felt like an inconvenience, but actually you're at war. Like, you don't need to be on the internet, right? Most of the time. And so sometimes you have to sort of check yourself when you're sitting in a forward operating base and you're upset because you can't check your social media, or you can't jump on Amazon and get a book out because your Kindle's battery's dead or something like that. So it's a very, very different experience. Particularly, you talk about 2003 to 2008, the two differences, and then modern conflict. So how has the internet, the social media, and modern communication technology, because mobile phones are the baseline of this, right? Afghanistan, the Roshan network, lots of people would have themselves a spare mobile phone that they could communicate on, which also brings in operational security issues. But how has this influenced the social cohesion and group dynamics amongst modern soldiers, especially when they're out there doing the job?
Yeah, so this is the kind of the theme, the thesis, right? The book is also just me revealing leadership qualities of when I failed or succeeded in adversity and in combat. But this aspect of constant telecommunication, right? The world changed by 2008, and now it's just completely different. But this ideal that there is no veil between war and society, between the soldier and his family. There's just no restrictions, right? In 2003, and I even go farther back in the book with World War I, World War II, telegrams, letters, the long ride home on the boat, things like that were all, part of just the things work, right? It was part of the character of warfare. And I know you appreciate that is constantly changing. What's interesting is as I picked up, so there's one incident, which is what the New York Times op-ed was about, which highlighted to me that maybe there was something different going on, where we were in a combat patrol in Baghdad. The enemy tried to attack one of my platoons with an RKG-3, grenade, basically an EFP on the stick, and threw it over a T-wall, missed the patrol, but it killed an Iraqi child. It was a very gruesome, very sad, very emotional moment for the platoon and for everybody that was there. I met them out there. I could tell that it had bothered the platoon as a group, and especially some of the leaders. So I kind of did the we got to wrap this up. It had ended. They were doing all their post engagement things, and I went back to our little combat outposts. I knew that they had returned, and I went to go find them, to talk to them about it, right? As leaders do, right? To check on the men. And what I found is that they'd already separated as a group, and they were all sitting on an internet or a cell phone or something like that in an internet cafe, talking to their loved ones back home, because some of them were seeking social support through their who they rely on. And as I picked that apart, I think it's changing or introducing new challenges to the actual cycle of warfare, like the actual individual soldiers' ability to form the bonds, right? If I told you that this is about shared hardship, the shared hardship wasn't actually only experiencing it together, but it was actually living with it together, coping with it. So back in 2003, after something like that, you would have came back and we just sat around the Humvee talking about it, walking through each event. Or the fact that just the fact that so many people were spending time online when they weren't on patrol meant that they were just not talking to each other as much. So I saw impacts on what I believed was external signs of cohesion, right? The way that soldiers talk to each other. But if you pull this back and even take it up to a higher level, there's been some research, and I am, of course, not the old guy pounding on the desk saying, all you young kids and your technology. But if left unchecked, and those moments, like not all time in the military is as a much value, but there are some critical times which that are actually bonding experiences, even if the military doesn't even realize that they are, whether that's you're doing of course they know exercise together, but eating together, sleeping in close proximity, or just living in close proximity to each other in combat, all these things that are really actually have also a bonding property. Mm-hmm. And then the coping mechanism, right? The coping mechanism for for if you go through a shared hardship as a group, one of the first coping mechanisms is the group, the identity of the group, people talking to each other about the issues that they're having. In the book, I also highlight how there's actually a pragmatic challenge to having a foot in both worlds, right? So you're deployed at war, fighting a war, and I know you can appreciate this, and most listeners can as well. You're in war, trying to focus on whatever the challenges are of the day. The person that you care about doesn't know what you're going through, and if there's an open line, then you'll be getting new stresses from home that just weren't there before. And the loved ones back home will be getting a new access to the challenges and the stresses and the emotions of war that they never had access to before as well. And I put examples in there, like the one example, which I think it was a real example, where one of my soldiers basically received a message that his pregnant girlfriend was overdosing on drugs. And he was, through the night, he was basically up on the phones and internet trying to deal with that. And basically we're headed out on our combat patrol, and the leaders came to me and said, he can't go out. He's a wreck. He has, not only does he have the problem, but he also didn't sleep for, the entire night dealing with this. And that might be viewed as bad, but it's also good, right? Because it's letting the group know that hey, he has a problem. And that maybe he might have internalized if it was a letter or something. That these are leader challenges, but the fact that these are new leadership challenges, this connected element of combat.
It's an interesting story. I mean, having the stresses of home meet you on the I'll say the front line, even though the front line is pretty much an amorphous thing these days, and apart from the First World War, the front line really was always an amorphous thing. But these challenges reaching you from home, I mean, I remember hearing about my sister's wedding while I was in the middle of our tactical operations center, and we were conducting strikes that day. So, making sure getting my head in the game and not wanting to go up to the computer center and check out the photos of the family, that was a happy circumstance, but still a distraction that you don't need when you're at war. And the connections bring other challenges, as you said. There's positives and negatives of it. And certainly, I know our listeners who know you're not the sort of bloke to be decrying modern technology, given your use of social media to help inform the global community on the challenges of modern urban conflict. Definitely wouldn't happen if it wasn't for modern technology. So you're definitely an embracer. So luckily, we can't call you the weather vane sitting there saying the storms are coming, but hey, maybe just watch out for a little bit of rain. The next part I want to discuss is the final part in your book, and I'm kind of hoping that we can talk about it in the context of the book and your experiences, but also where we can go from here and what it means, particularly for conflicts like the Ukraine. Now, this show we could have started the year off talking about the conflict in Ukraine. We were very careful not to have a running commentary on the Ukraine because it's been covered quite aptly by a lot of other outlets, and we have just been cautious about things like operational security and the use of social media and what you're hearing, right? And I've actually been quite impressed with the way some other platforms have covered it. There's the Voices of War podcast do a very good synopsis with people. I know that John, I'm pretty sure you've been on there. I think I've heard your voice on the Voices of War. It's another Aussie podcast, but the way that show has done it hasn't been trying to provide people with today's knowledge of it. They're getting experts after they've consolidated the information, which is good. But I'm kind of hoping we can dabble a little bit in how this term that you use in your book relates to modern warfare. I know that for most of our listeners, Ukraine is the most prominent one in their mind, but also I want modern listeners to realize, there are a lot of global conflicts happening right now. The Ukraine is one that just happens to involve a global power, a nuclear armed power, and therefore we hear a lot about it in the Western media. But this is relevant for a lot of the conflicts still occurring in the Middle East, still occurring in other nations in Africa, and there's a few things, border skirmishes and those types of conflicts still occurring. So, if you want to look deeper into this, please don't limit yourself to just the ones that the media is throwing up to you, because that happens to be the one that is the most popular, unfortunately. But after I get down off my soapbox, John, I was going to ask you this question. You talk about connected warfare in your book. What does this term mean? And why is it important for communities and also soldiers and leaders of soldiers going into future conflicts?
Yeah, so I actually got a little pushback from reviewers on using that term connected warfare, because it has so many meanings from even like we've been talking about, the individual soldier. There is no disconnecting of them from their lives, their identities, their social support networks when they go to war, as both an individual and as a group. But really, you can take this element of all war will be connected going into the future, all warfare, and even tying this to Big Carl and the Trinity. If we all have access to a new level of information on what's happening in war or warfare, it's going to impact every facet of it, right? It's going to impact the soldiers, the military executing it. It's going to impact the politicians that are having to deal with the global information operations on reports all the way down to the tactical level, coming instantaneously on whatever it is. And it's going to impact, of course, the population's will to continue the operations. So in of its sense, it's just the fact that war will be connected. You're not going to disconnect it. You're not going to control that access to information, because one, soldiers will find a way. It doesn't matter where you are. Soldiers want to be connected to what matters most. And at certain moments, it is their combat family. Other times, just like when the part of my book where my wife goes off to war and my 3 kids want to talk to mom. And it was a reality that they could talk to her almost every night through FaceTime. And that had its own implications on our children. But I also wrote this book before COVID. Before COVID taught the world that humans need physical connections. So that's the other part, right? Connected warfare, the enduring nature of warfare is human. Is you can't replace that with virtual. So even if a soldier, a nation, or whatever is connected to whatever it is, they still need physical connections to each other, either to fight, survive, live with war. And I wrote it before Ukraine. So you can take Ukraine and I could watch a live feed of, like you said, a nuclear power invading another country. I could watch that live from my computer, and I still can on YouTube channels, whatever. And it's just exposing the themes of war will be connected, and this idea that you're going to do anything without those connections. And that for us as military professionals, scholars, whatever, is what are the implications at echelon to whether that's how to lead a small team in combat or how to execute an operation in a new connected world.
If we look at the changes in public perception based on the broadcasting of Vietnam, it's now modern technology is taking that to the nth degree. And I guess from my point of view, I believe there's a bit of a danger in how much information gets flooded into the media, because there can be an apathy. You talk about physical connection is something that humans need. Sometimes if you don't experience something physically, it's hard to empathize, and it builds an apathy. And one of the concerns I have, although I am someone who produces content, digital content and programs talking about war and uses these technologies, but the aim is to try and build an understanding and empathy amongst my audiences that war occurs, because let's be honest, the majority of my audience don't experience war and probably won't ever in their lifetime. For those who haven't served, that's a good thing, but we must remember that watching the war in the Ukraine is actually people's lives, and I think that connectedness comes with that risk that we build this desensitization to conflicts far away, because they still seem far away, whether or not we're hearing about them or not.
No, and I think this has been the evolution of warfare, right? So we don't need Cronkite coming back from the Tet Offensive and telling the American population how bad it's going in Vietnam and strategically changing the direction of the United States in a war anymore. I mean, I'm a part of forums now where I get information 24 hours, 48 hours before it actually hits media. So we're almost past TikTok wars or CNN wars. We're past that, where you have live connections to actual I learned about the horrors of Bucha before the first photo was shown on international news.
Yeah, and it's it'll be interesting to see as the conflict prolongs, this one that it's captured so much of the world's attention, what it does for I guess global community responses to conflict. Hopefully it goes the right way.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. That's the point, right? It's just the new reality. So if you're holding on to the old, I know you've talked about it, whatever the topic is we have to adapt. I mean, it's also extremely powerful where, a single leader of a country can issue a message out that inspires the will to fight, unlike ever before in history, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've got the Ukrainian president. He's addressed Congress. He's addressed the US Senate. He's addressed the Australian Parliament, both the upper and lower houses, all done through modern technology. And an important part of what's occurred in how he's generated that moral component of fighting power is remaining in the country where he could have fled.
Absolutely.
And we know that was important for the British monarchy in the Second World War, where they had the opportunity to flee to Canada and they didn't. And we can see Zelensky staying. He didn't jump on a plane and do the global tour, help me fighting in my country. He stayed in his country. And how was he able to still broadcast that message? He used the modern technology, which is, here we have video teleconferencing contributing to the moral component of fighting power. Now, John, my listeners are probably close to parking the car or close to getting off the treadmill. So we have one question here, right? This is the butcher's bill on this show. This is what you have to pay me for coming on the show, right? You've got to answer my final question. It's a question people have been struggling with, at least since 1832. We know that. Well, actually, probably before that, because that's when Marie started getting ready to publish it. But Big Carl himself was struggling for this his whole life after fighting numerous battles. So my final question is one I ask of all guests. As a listener of the show, you've had some good preparation for this question, and it relates to our mission on the show. And our mission on the show is to define war in as many ways as possible. We just talked about, you have to adapt your mindset about what war is and what it means to society, and how we need to respond to war, and also to drive conversations around war. You need to define things to discuss them meaningfully. So we want to do this in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. I ask each guest to finish the sentence war is. So, John, I ask you, please finish the sentence war is.
So I've been waiting for this question for a long time. One, you'll see me on CNN just stating what Big Carl said war is, especially the execution of policy by other means. If you put a knife to me and say, give me your answer, I will say I'm a realist. So war is the application of violence or the threat of violence to seize, maintain, and control power.
That's bloody good. That's an
Thanks.
original one too, John. So, and I've got to say, we're up in the triple digits for episodes now, so it's difficult to get original ones. When,
Yeah, right.
Particularly a lot of our guests, we're all connected. We all write together. We publish together. There's a danger that we all have groupthink on what is. Big Carl's right. We'll just say what Big Carl says. But that's a good one. I really like the part about power there.
Yeah.
I'm not going to say I like the part about violence, because then my listeners will think I'm some sort of warmonger. But the bit about power is very, very important. A lot of our listeners talk about will, impose will, which essentially is a power dynamic. So
absolutely,
John, I'm very, very glad that you came up with one that is something that I'm actually going to have to think about quite a bit, because it's a new one. As our listeners we'll find out pretty soon on social media, and they'll find out right now from me. We're moving towards providing transcripts of the show in volumes that people can purchase, which will have a list of all the definitions of what war is. And one of the programs, an education program I ran for a client, which was a Western military. I won't say which one it was, but one of the programs I ran for a client was taking junior officers through defining war over 8 weeks. They had to just continually define war, and the different definitions they come, and some of them were so ridiculous as well, because they're young people, and I'm old enough now to say young people are ridiculous. But things like the synergistic execution. I don't know what that means, but it's fascinating to see. And what I can say is that with experience in education, you start to see these refinements, even in short periods of time, over 8 weeks. Or we have someone like yourself that spent over 25 years in this environment, writing and helping people think about it. So, John, thank you very much for coming on the show and helping us continue this conversation.
Hey, thanks, brother. It's been an honor.
Now, listeners, as I said, we do have some transcripts coming out. Volume 1 should be out for the end of the year, hopefully in time for stocking filler. If not, that's fine, because I don't imagine you'll have too many relatives that will thank you if you do put a copy of Volume 1 transcripts of the Dead Prussian podcast in their stocking, or you might do. I do actually know a couple of people that are married to co-fans of the show, so that must be some really great dinner table conversations. I can tell you, war doesn't get much playtime in our house. I do apologize for the delay in the season this year, folks. For those who know, the state I live in Australia, we've been hit pretty hard this year with some climate change, and also the Dead Prussian studios. We moved further north just in time for all those hits. So we've been a little bit busy, but we will get you a truncated 2022 season. As you can tell, it's been kicked off with some great discussion on some very, very interesting challenges for modern warfare. So we'll have that out there. One way you can help me, listeners, is we need iTunes reviews to keep the show going in terms of reach. So we can reach through our organic word of mouth with all the listeners talking to their friends and their colleagues. We can reach out on social media, and I love that people do that for us. But if you give us reviews on iTunes, the everyday average podcast consumer will start to see us pop up there. And once you do that, we've got a way forward to reach a broader audience, and that's what we're all about on this show. My final thing, what I really need you to do is to buy John's book. The reason I need you to buy John's book, Connected Soldiers, is because if you click the Amazon link in our show notes, we will get a little bit of 10 come back our way. Now, we don't take it out of John's pocket. I don't even think we take it out of the publisher's pocket. I think we take it out of Jeff Bezos's pocket. And to be honest, that's a really good thing. Instead of funding his space jaunts, why don't we just fund the Dead Prussian so we can keep these chats going? So please click the Connected Soldiers link in the show notes. Go to Amazon, purchase the book. It's in all formats, so it's a pretty easy book to get. And give it a listen, give it a read, however you consume it. And then finally, once you've done it, jump on Twitter, follow John at Spencer Guard, and tell him what you thought about the book. If you've got some really negative comments, maybe do that in a DM or something, because, just common courtesy, just be polite. But jump on there, join his conversation, even if you just follow him on Twitter to understand how urban warfare is evolving in the global context, and also He's doing a lot of commentary around the conflict in Ukraine at the moment, and he's definitely worth following. Two people that I think are key to following on that particular conflict at the moment is at Spencer Guard, John Spencer, and also Major General Mick Ryan. He's retired. He's also doing a lot, and the Australian public has actually benefited quite a lot from him writing quite a bit, which has been excellent. And if you need his details, listen to the previous episode because it was a chat with him last year. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.